They thought they were dragging a nobody out of church, but the truth had already walked through those doors before the first hand ever touched her. Sunday morning sunlight poured through the stained glass windows of New Hope Baptist Church, painting the front steps in soft shades of blue, gold, and crimson as the final notes of the choir still lingered in the air like a prayer refusing to fade. Families in pressed suits and bright dresses moved slowly toward the fellowship hall, their voices warm, their laughter gentle, the kind of sound that made the whole block feel safe. It was supposed to be the kind of morning people remembered for peace, for grace, for the quiet comfort of being surrounded by those who knew your name. But peace has a way of disappearing quickly when power walks in wearing a badge and a bad assumption. Naomi Carter had arrived alone, 10 minutes before the benediction ended, dressed in a simple navy dress and a cream coat that brushed just below her knees. She carried a worn leather purse in one hand and a large brown envelope in the other, sealed tight like whatever was inside mattered more than comfort, more than convenience, maybe even more than her own dignity. She walked with calm purpose, not hurried, not timid, just steady, the way people move when they know exactly why they are there. Some of the older church mothers near the entrance smiled at her politely. A young usher opened the door and gave a quick nod. Naomi returned the gesture with a softness in her eyes. But there was something else there too, something unreadable, like a storm held far behind glass. She had almost reached the top of the front steps when the first voice cut through the holy hush of the morning. "Ma'am, stop right there." The words landed hard enough to make nearby conversations die mid-sentence. Naomi turned slowly. Two police officers were coming up the walkway, one tall and broad-shouldered with a hand already resting too comfortably near his belt, the other shorter, younger, but following closely with the stiff confidence of someone who had learned how to echo another man's certainty. Officer Derek Vaughn took the lead, his jaw set, his expression already shaped by suspicion before a single question had been asked. Behind him, Officer Blake Turner scanned the crowd as phones began to rise, as whispers began to spread, as that terrible kind of silence started gathering in the spaces between people. Naomi stood still, the envelope held close against her side. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice low and even, the kind of voice that did not beg to be believed because it had no intention of performing fear for anyone. Derek looked her up and down as if her presence itself was an offense. "We received a report about unauthorized activity on church property," he said, each word clipped and cold. "I'm going to need you to step away from the entrance and place that envelope where I can see it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone near the door said there must be some mistake. Another voice whispered that Naomi had not done anything except walk up the steps. But Derek did not seem interested in mistakes. He seemed interested in control. Naomi's fingers tightened around the envelope, not in panic, but in protection. "This is a misunderstanding," she said. "I'm here to meet someone." Derek stepped closer. "You can explain that after we sort this out." The choir's final chord had barely disappeared, and already the morning had turned into something else entirely. Naomi did not move, and somehow that stillness unsettled the crowd more than if she had argued. The church steps, warm with morning light just seconds earlier, now felt like a stage nobody had agreed to stand on. Children were being quietly pulled closer by their parents. Deacons in dark suits lingered near the entrance with uncertain expressions, torn between reverence for the place behind them and fear of the uniforms in front of them. The stained glass windows above cast long bands of color across the stone, laying shades of blue and red over polished shoes, folded hands, and tense faces, as if even the building itself could feel that something had shifted. Officer Derek Vaughn extended his hand toward the envelope. "Ma'am, set it down now." His tone was not loud, but it was sharp in the way some voices are when they are used to being obeyed. Without question, Officer Blake Turner stepped slightly to Naomi's right, closing off the narrow space between the railing and the front door. Together they formed the kind of silent wall people understood immediately. Naomi looked from one officer to the other, and then beyond them to the line of churchgoers gathering along the sidewalk. She saw phones rising inch by inch. She saw discomfort hiding behind lowered eyes. She saw one elderly woman press a hand to her chest, as if she had just witnessed something sacred being interrupted by something cold and foreign. Naomi lowered her gaze for only a second, then looked back at Derek with the same controlled calm. "This envelope is for Pastor Brooks," she said. "It was requested personally." Derek's expression did not change. "You can tell him that later. For now, I am asking you one last time to cooperate." The word cooperate hung in the air the way certain words always do when they are used less as a request than as a warning. A teenager standing near the flower bed whispered to his mother that the woman had not done anything wrong. His mother did not answer. She just tightened her grip on his wrist and kept watching. Pastor Elijah Brooks had not stepped outside yet, but several people near the vestibule had begun looking back through the open doors, wondering whether someone from inside would come and put an end to this before it crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Naomi adjusted her hold on the envelope, careful, almost protective, as though the papers inside mattered in ways nobody here could understand yet. "I am not resisting, officer," she said. "I am simply asking you to slow down and verify who called this in." Derek gave a dry smile that never reached his eyes. "That is not your concern." What concerned him, apparently, was the fact that Naomi still sounded composed. There was no pleading in her voice, no confusion, no trembling apology designed to make him feel larger than he already did. She stood with a kind of quiet self-possession that made his authority look smaller by comparison, and men like Derek noticed that kind of thing immediately. He stepped closer, lowering his voice as if that made the moment more reasonable. "You are making this harder than it needs to be." Naomi met his stare. "No, officer," she said softly. "I think someone already did that before you arrived." That line moved through the crowd like a spark. Heads turned. Someone near the back let out a breath that sounded almost like disbelief. Blake shifted uncomfortably and glanced at Derek, sensing what the older officer did not want to admit, that this woman did not sound like someone caught off guard. She sounded like someone measuring the room. For a brief second, Naomi's attention drifted to the church doors behind the officers. The brass handle, the open Bible on the welcome table just inside, the faint echo of voices from the fellowship hall. Then her eyes returned to the front steps, where the morning stood balanced on a knife's edge. It should have been a simple misunderstanding cleared up in less than 60 seconds. Instead, the silence deepened, and with every passing moment, it felt less like an arrest was beginning and more like something hidden was preparing to reveal itself. Imagine standing on the steps of your own church, surrounded by hymn books and Sunday smiles, and realizing in one cold instant that the room had already judged you before you ever said your name. Naomi could feel it now, that subtle but familiar shift in the air, the moment when uncertainty stopped being uncertainty and hardened into assumption. The crowd was larger than before. More members had spilled out from the sanctuary and the fellowship hall, drawn by the stillness, the uniforms, and the terrible gravity of a public confrontation unfolding where handshakes and blessings were supposed to be exchanged. A little girl in a pale yellow dress peeked from behind her mother's side, wide-eyed and silent. An older deacon removed his glasses and held them in his hand, as if seeing the moment more clearly would somehow make it easier to understand. But there was nothing easy about it. Officer Derek Vaughn had the look of a man who believed hesitation was weakness. He took one more step toward Naomi, his polished boots scraping lightly against the church stone, and nodded toward the envelope again. "Set it down now." Naomi let the words settle without rushing to answer. Her heart was steady, but not because the moment did not matter. It mattered deeply. Every eye on her, every whisper, every silent choice being made by the people around her, all of it mattered. She had spent too many years walking into rooms where the truth arrived later than judgment not to recognize the pattern. And yet she stood exactly as she had when she first climbed those steps, shoulders level, chin lifted, one hand holding her purse, the other holding the envelope that seemed to trouble Derek more than her presence ever could. "It contains documents for Pastor Brooks," she said. "If you let me hand it to him, this misunderstanding can end right here." Blake glanced toward the open church doors, and for the first time there was something uncertain in his face. He was younger, less polished in his authority, less practiced at pretending he could not hear the murmurs around him. The crowd was changing. Not louder, but less passive. A woman near the railing quietly said Naomi had been invited. Another voice said somebody should go get the pastor. Someone else muttered that this was getting out of hand. Derek turned his head toward the crowd with the irritation of a man who preferred witnesses to stay invisible. "Nobody asked for commentary," he said flatly. Then his attention snapped back to Naomi. "You have been asked multiple times. Do not make this into something bigger." Naomi's eyes held his without flinching. "Bigger," she repeated softly, as if trying the word against the truth of the moment. Then she looked past him to the church parking lot, where rows of cars shimmered under the late morning sun and heat rose in faint waves above the pavement. To the crowd, it might have looked like a woman searching for help. But Naomi was not searching. She was measuring time. She checked the distance in her head the same way some people checked a clock. A black sedan had not arrived yet. Pastor Brooks had still not appeared. And the envelope in her hand had become the center of a moment far more revealing than the papers inside it. Derek noticed her glance and misread it immediately. "Waiting for somebody to save you?" he asked, the edge in his voice almost satisfied now, as if he had finally found the weakness he was hoping to see. Naomi gave the smallest shake of her head. "No, officer," she said. "I think I am waiting for people to show me who they really are." That sentence did not sound loud, but it landed like one. Even Blake looked at her differently after that, as if some piece of the scene had shifted out of place in his mind. Near the door, one of the ushers slipped back inside at last, moving quickly now, and Naomi noticed. She also noticed the way Derek's confidence had started to harden into something more brittle. He still believed he was in control. But control, Naomi knew, often sounded strongest right before it cracked. Derek Vaughn had expected hesitation, apology, maybe even fear. What he had not expected was a woman who refused to shrink for his comfort. That was the part that unsettled him, though he would never have said it out loud. Naomi Carter did not look away, did not stumble over her words, did not perform innocence in the desperate way he was used to seeing when a crowd gathered and a badge stepped in close. She simply stood there on the church steps with sunlight crossing her face and that sealed envelope resting steady in her hand, as if she understood something about this moment that no one else did yet. The crowd felt it too. The tension was no longer coming only from the officers. It was spreading through the people watching, moving from person to person like a current too quiet to hear, but too strong to ignore. A church mother in a white hat whispered that Naomi had been seen speaking with the front office earlier that week. One of the younger ushers, barely out of high school, shifted from foot to foot and looked toward the parking lot as if waiting for someone important to arrive. Two men near the bottom of the steps had stopped pretending this was ordinary. Their faces had gone still in the way people do when they realize they are witnessing the exact moment a line is being crossed. Derek felt the atmosphere slipping and pushed harder. He straightened his shoulders and raised his voice just enough for the people nearby to hear every word. "Ma'am, if you continue refusing instructions on church property, you may leave us no choice but to detain you until this situation is resolved." The phrasing was polished, official, almost clean, but everyone heard what sat beneath it. Naomi did not react right away. She looked at him with an expression that was not anger and not fear, something calmer and heavier than both. Then she glanced once more toward the church doors. Still no Pastor Brooks. Still no interruption. Still no one with enough courage to step fully into the space between authority and injustice. That silence said almost as much as Derek's voice. Blake shifted beside him, visibly uncomfortable now. He leaned toward Derek and said something too low for most of the crowd to hear, but Naomi caught a piece of it. "Maybe we should confirm with the office." Derek did not take his eyes off Naomi. "We already have a call," he muttered back. "That is enough." But it was not enough, and the people watching knew it. An older man at the rail frowned and said in a low voice that church property was not a crime scene. A woman near the front nodded, lips pressed tight, her phone held upright and recording every second. Derek heard them and turned his irritation outward. "If everyone would step back and let us do our job, this will go faster." Nobody moved. That, more than anything, changed the feel of the moment. The crowd was still quiet, but it was no longer passive. Their silence had begun to take sides. Naomi seemed to notice that too. She lowered her gaze briefly to the envelope in her hand and ran her thumb once along its edge, almost absent-mindedly, though there was nothing absent in the way she moved. It looked like a simple gesture, but it carried the strange weight of someone protecting a final piece of a much larger truth. When she spoke again, her voice was calm enough to make Derek sound harsher by comparison. "Officer," she said, "if you stop this now, there is still room for this morning to end with dignity." A faint murmur ran through the crowd. The sentence did not sound like a threat. That was what made it so powerful. It sounded like mercy being offered to someone too proud to realize he needed it. Derek's jaw tightened instantly. He stepped closer, invading the small space Naomi had kept around herself since the beginning, and his tone cooled into something more personal. "You do not get to tell me how this ends." Naomi lifted her eyes to his, and for the first time, there was something almost sorrowful in her face, as if she had hoped he might choose better and was watching that hope disappear in real time. "No," she said softly, "but you are telling everyone else." At that exact moment, the church doors opened wider behind them, and the hush that followed felt less like relief and more like the first breath before revelation. Pastor Elijah Brooks stepped into the doorway with the startled expression of a man who had left one room of worship and walked straight into another kind of judgment. He was still holding a folded program in one hand and his reading glasses in the other, his dark suit catching the colored light pouring through the stained glass behind him. For half a second, his eyes moved from Derek Vaughn to Blake Turner to the circle of church members gathered on the steps, and then finally to Naomi Carter. The moment he recognized her, something changed in his face so quickly that only the people closest to the door could fully see it. It was not confusion. It was not surprise. It was alarm sharpened by recognition. Naomi caught it immediately. So did two of the women standing near the welcome table inside the vestibule. But Derek did not. He only heard footsteps and assumed they would validate him. "Pastor," he called out before Brooks could speak, "did you request this woman to be here today?" The question hung in the air with the weight of something that should have settled the matter in one breath. But Pastor Brooks did not answer right away. His eyes dropped to the envelope in Naomi's hand, then lifted to her face. And in that silent exchange, there was a current too deep for the rest of the crowd to understand. It was as if a conversation had already been happening long before this morning, long before these steps, long before Derek had decided he knew enough to intervene. Naomi gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, and Brooks swallowed hard. "She is here on church business," he said carefully. The words should have ended everything. Instead, they only made Derek's expression harden. "Church business," he repeated, as though the phrase itself offended him. "We received a report that she was attempting to access restricted office areas without authorization." Brooks took one step forward, the reading glasses now hanging loosely at his side. "She had authorization. I asked her to come." Around them, the crowd released a collective breath. Some looked relieved. Others looked angry now, because the answer they had needed had finally arrived, and it had not come too late to hear, but perhaps too late to undo what had already been revealed. Blake's shoulders dropped slightly, as though some inner tension had loosened. But Derek did not step back. If anything, he became more rigid, more committed to the version of events he had already chosen. Then why was she carrying a sealed envelope and refusing to hand it over? He asked. Brooks hesitated again, and that hesitation was small, but not small enough. Naomi saw it. Derek saw it. The people watching saw it too. In that narrow pause, the morning shifted again, because now the issue was no longer just Derek's assumption. Now there was a secret standing between the pastor's answer and Naomi's silence. Brooks cleared his throat and chose his words with visible care. "Those documents are private. They concern matters we plan to discuss after service." Derek gave a humorless laugh. "Private enough to call the police?" he asked. Brooks blinked. "I did not call the police." That sentence landed heavier than any raised voice could have. Several people on the steps turned immediately toward Derek and Blake. A woman near the rail lowered her phone for the first time, stunned. One of the deacons frowned and looked toward the parking lot as if searching for a missing piece. Naomi remained motionless, but inside, another quiet measure clicked into place. Someone else had made the call. Someone inside the church, or close enough to it, had known she was coming and had wanted the moment interrupted before she could reach Brooks with that envelope. Derek's authority suddenly looked less certain, because now the question was not whether Naomi belonged there. The question was who had wanted everyone to believe she did not. Naomi finally spoke, her voice low but clear enough for the whole front entrance to hear. "Pastor, are all the trustees here today?" Brooks looked at her, startled by the question. "Not all of them," he said slowly. Naomi gave a faint nod, as though that answer confirmed something she had suspected all along. The envelope remained in her hand, untouched, carrying the kind of silence that made people lean in without realizing it. Behind the crowd, Somewhere beyond the rows of parked cars and the white church sign out by the road, the distant hum of an approaching engine began to rise. Most people did not notice it yet. Naomi did, and when she lifted her eyes toward the street, the calm in her face deepened into something else entirely. Not relief, not triumph, certainty. The truth was, Naomi Carter had known before she ever stepped onto those church steps that this morning might not unfold in peace. She had not come to New Hope Baptist Church by accident, and she had not come simply to deliver papers like an ordinary messenger. 3 weeks earlier, in a quiet office nearly 20 miles away, she had sat beneath cold fluorescent lights reviewing donation records, property transfers, sealed complaints, and a string of anonymous letters that all pointed back to the same place. At first glance, New Hope looked like the kind of church people trusted without question, the kind with food drives in the winter, youth programs in the summer, and enough Sunday warmth to make anyone believe goodness lived safely inside its walls. But money had been disappearing. Community grants meant for housing support, after-school tutoring, and meals for elderly residents had been rerouted through shell accounts hidden behind respectable names and polished signatures. Naomi had seen corruption before in city offices, nonprofit boards, and neighborhood councils, but this case carried a different kind of ache because it reached into a sanctuary, into a place where people brought grief, hope, and the last of what they could afford. Pastor Elijah Brooks had not been her target. He had been the one who finally reached out when the numbers stopped making sense and 2 trustees began pressuring him to sign documents he knew were wrong. He had asked for a discreet meeting after service, away from the church office, away from anyone who might overhear. That was why Naomi came alone. That was why she dressed simply. That was why she carried the envelope herself instead of trusting it to mail, courier, or assistant. Inside were copies of transfer ledgers, witness statements, frozen account requests, and a provisional warrant package awaiting one final confirmation. She had planned to hand it to Brooks, confirm the last names, and make one call from her car. Quiet, clean, dignified. But someone had learned just enough to panic. Someone had known she was coming, known enough to place a call without asking questions, known enough to trust that 2 officers would see a black woman approaching a church office with a sealed envelope and assume suspicion before truth. Naomi had counted on resistance from the people hiding money. She had not counted on the speed with which bias would volunteer itself. And yet, standing there beneath the stained glass and the stairs, she could not say she was surprised. She had spent her adult life walking into institutions built on polished language and hidden fear, places where calm black women were treated as problems the moment they refused to be explained away. That was why she had remained still. Stillness forced people to fill the silence with themselves. Derek Vaughn had filled it with control. Blake Turner had filled it with doubt. The crowd had filled it with discomfort, then conscience. Pastor Brooks had filled it with recognition and worry. And somewhere beyond all of them, the person who placed that call was learning a painful lesson about timing, because delay only works when truth does not know how to wait. Naomi had learned long ago that revelation did not always arrive with raised voices or slammed doors. Sometimes it came in the form of a simple question asked at the right moment. Sometimes it came in the form of a car engine turning into a church lot while guilty people were still pretending to be calm. She looked toward the road again, hearing the sound grow clearer now, steady and deliberate. And for the first time that morning, she let herself exhale fully. Not because she felt rescued. Naomi had never needed rescuing. But because the window for pretense was closing, and everyone standing on those church steps was about to learn that the woman they had tried to stop had not come carrying trouble. She had come carrying the end of it. The black sedan turned into the church lot without hurry, its dark body catching the sun in slow flashes as it rolled past the fellowship hall and came to a stop near the front steps. It was not the kind of arrival that announced itself with noise. It did not need to. Something about the way it moved, the way it stopped, the way the driver stepped out first and scanned the entrance with immediate purpose, changed the temperature of the morning before a single word was spoken. The crowd felt it. Conversations died again. Phones lifted higher. Even the children seemed to sense that whatever happened next would divide the day into before and after. Derek Vaughn turned toward the lot with visible irritation, as if the timing itself offended him. Blake followed his gaze, and the uncertainty that had been creeping across his face all morning deepened into something sharper. Two men in dark suits stepped from the sedan, both wearing the kind of neutral expression that did not invite questions. Then a third figure emerged from the rear passenger side, taller than the others, silver at the temples, posture straight, eyes fixed on the church steps from the second his shoes touched the pavement. He did not look confused. He did not look curious. He looked like a man arriving exactly where he expected to be, exactly when he expected to arrive. Naomi saw him and gave no dramatic reaction, no sigh of relief, no sudden smile. She simply straightened the envelope in her hand and stood as if a final piece had clicked into place. Pastor Brooks took in the scene and stepped back half a pace, the color shifting in his face. Derek noticed Naomi's composure and mistook it for defiance one last time. He raised his voice, ready to control the moment before it slipped any further from his hands. This area is restricted during an active police response, he called toward the approaching men. State your business. The man in front never broke stride. His shoes hit the pavement with measured precision as he crossed the last stretch of parking lot and mounted the bottom step. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, deep, and unmistakably official. Deputy Director Marcus Hale, Office of Special Investigations. His eyes moved from Derek to Blake, then settled on Naomi with the familiarity of someone who did not need an introduction. Agent Carter, he said, are you all right? The silence that followed did not feel human. It felt structural, as if the entire front of the church had frozen under the weight of one sentence. A woman near the rail covered her mouth. One of the deacons whispered something that never fully became sound. Blake's expression drained all at once, his shoulders falling as understanding hit him harder than any accusation could have. Derek did not move. For the first time that morning, the confidence in his face had nowhere to stand. Naomi met Marcus Hale's eyes and answered with the same steadiness she had carried from the beginning. I am fine, Deputy Director. Delayed, but fine. Hale's gaze shifted to the envelope in her hand, then to the officers blocking her path. Delayed. The words settled into the crowd with almost surgical precision. He turned to Pastor Brooks. Reverend, were you expecting Agent Carter this morning? Brooks nodded immediately now, his hesitation gone, replaced by the urgency of a man who understood exactly how exposed everything had become. Yes, sir, he said. I was. Hale looked back at Derek Vaughn, and there was no anger in his expression, which somehow made it worse. Only clarity. Officer, he said, do you understand that you have interrupted an active confidential inquiry involving financial misconduct, witness protection concerns, and federal coordination? Derek opened his mouth, but no answer came out right away. The crowd watched the silence claim him. Naomi remained still, her eyes forward, the colored light from the stained glass falling across her face like something almost sacred. For the first time all morning, she was no longer being looked at as a problem to remove. She was being seen for what she had been from the beginning, the person carrying the truth. No one on those church steps seemed to know what to do with silence once it stopped protecting the wrong people. It had covered Derek Vaughn a few moments earlier, wrapped him in the easy confidence of a man who thought a badge could explain away instinct, assumption, and interruption. But now silence had turned on him. It stood beside Naomi Carter instead, calm and immovable, while the crowd watched the shape of power change in real time. Deputy Director Marcus Hale did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He extended his hand, and Naomi placed the sealed envelope into it with the kind of precision that told everyone this was not a rescue. It was procedure. Hale opened the flap, removed the documents, and scanned the first page with practiced focus. Beside him, one of the men in dark suits stepped slightly aside and spoke into a phone in a low tone, relaying names, confirming locations, setting movements in motion that had clearly been waiting for this last piece to fall into place. Pastor Elijah Brooks stood near the doorway, his face heavy with relief and shame all at once, as though he could not decide whether to feel grateful that truth had arrived or grieved by how much had been exposed before it did. Naomi remained where she was, her hands now free of the envelope, her posture unchanged, but the space around her had transformed. The same crowd that had watched her in uncertainty was now watching her with stunned recognition. They had seen a woman treated like an intruder, and now they were realizing she had been the one person there who actually knew what was happening. Hale turned one page, then another. The sound of paper moving in the morning air seemed louder than it should have. He looked up at Brooks first. Reverend, the flag transfers matched the preliminary audit. The trustee signatures listed here are the same names we have tied to the outside accounts. Brooks closed his eyes for a brief second, as if hearing it spoken aloud. Made the betrayal more final. I was afraid of that, he said quietly. Hale nodded once, then shifted his attention to the officers. Because of the interruption this morning, we now have multiple witnesses, public video, and direct evidence that an active inquiry was interfered with before contact could be completed. Blake Turner looked down immediately, the tension in his face collapsing into something closer to embarrassment. He had not spoken in nearly a minute, and now his silence felt less like loyalty and more like regret. Derek, on the other hand, was still trying to hold together a version of events that had already come apart in front of him. He cleared his throat and finally managed to speak. We were responding to a call, he said, but even to his own ears the explanation sounded smaller than before. Hale folded the papers carefully and handed them to the man at his side. A call from whom, officer? That question moved through the crowd like a stone dropped into deep water. Derek hesitated. He did not know. That had been obvious from the beginning, but it sounded different now, with everyone listening. A deacon near the rail frowned and looked toward the church doors. One of the ushers whispered that only a few people knew Naomi was expected. Another church member, still recording, slowly turned the phone toward the faces gathered near the entrance, toward the trustees who were not there, toward the realization spreading one painful inch at a time. Naomi watched all of it without satisfaction. What settled over her face was not triumph. It was something steadier. The look of a woman who had seen this pattern before and hated how familiar it still was. She had come to protect a community's trust, and before the truth could even be delivered, someone had counted on suspicion to do the work of delay. Hale seemed to understand that without her saying it. He turned toward Naomi and asked, Agent Carter, based on what occurred here this morning, do you believe the source of the call had prior knowledge of your scheduled contact? Naomi did not answer quickly. She let the question breathe, let every person on those steps feel the weight of what it meant. Then she said, Yes, sir. And I believe whoever made that call expected these officers to see me before they saw the facts. No one argued with her. No one could, because by then the truth was no longer hidden in the envelope, or in the records, or in the names on a transfer ledger. It was standing in plain sight on the front steps of a church, and everybody had just watched it happen. The church steps did not erupt into chaos after that. They sank into something heavier, something harder to escape than noise. It was the weight of recognition, the kind that settles over a crowd when people realize they did not just witness a misunderstanding. They witnessed a mirror. Deputy Director Marcus Hale stepped aside just enough for the men with him to continue making calls, confirming names, securing the documents Naomi had carried there with such quiet care. No sirens screamed. No one shouted. But the machinery of consequence had already begun to move, and somehow that made the morning feel even more serious. Pastor Elijah Brooks stood with his shoulders lowered, as if truth had taken years off his strength and given back only clarity. He looked at Naomi with the grief of a shepherd who had watched wolves circle too close to the sanctuary and had almost opened the gate himself by trusting the wrong faces for too long. I am sorry, he said, and his voice cracked not from weakness, but from the burden of knowing apology could not return dignity once it had been publicly tested. Naomi turned toward him fully for the first time since the confrontation began. Her expression remained composed, but there was a softness in it now, one reserved for people who had chosen late but finally chosen right. You called me because you knew something was wrong, she said. Hold on to that. Truth does not ask us to be perfect. It asks us to stop pretending. A few people in the crowd lowered their eyes at that, not because the words were harsh, but because they were true. Derek Vaughn remained near the edge of the steps, still wearing the uniform that had seemed so unquestionable less than 10 minutes earlier. Yet now the badge on his chest looked smaller somehow, as if stripped of the illusion he had wrapped around it all morning. Nobody needed Naomi to scold him. Nobody needed Marcus Hale to humiliate him. The scene had already done what it needed to do. Every church member standing there had seen the same thing. They had seen how quickly suspicion had attached itself to a black woman carrying documents and walking toward a church office. They had seen how slowly courtesy, patience, and verification had arrived behind it. And they had seen who paid the price for that delay. Blake Turner finally spoke, his voice low and unsteady. "Ma'am, I should have asked more questions." Naomi looked at him, and in her gaze was neither vindication nor easy forgiveness. Only truth. "Yes," she said. "You should have." He nodded once, unable to hold her eyes for long. That was the thing about conscience. Once it wakes up, it does not let a person hide comfortably again. Somewhere in the back, the little girl in the pale yellow dress was still watching. Her mother bent down and whispered something to her, then took her hand a little more gently than before. The deacon who had removed his glasses earlier now put them back on and stood straighter, as if seeing clearly carried responsibility with it. One by one, the people on those steps began to understand that this morning was not only about Naomi Carter, or Derek Vaughn, or the missing funds, or the hidden call. It was about the terrible ease with which dignity can be questioned when power meets prejudice, and the sacred duty of ordinary people not to look away when that happens in front of them. Naomi glanced down near the doorway and noticed a Bible resting on the welcome table just inside, its pages stirring slightly from the air moving through the open entrance. She took a step forward at last, not rushed, not triumphant, just steady. The crowd parted for her now without being told. Marcus Hale followed with the documents. Pastor Brooks moved aside and held the door. As Naomi crossed the threshold, colored light from the stained glass fell across her coat and face, and for one brief moment, she seemed less like someone entering a church than like someone returning something to it. Not money, not evidence, not control, something more fragile than all three. Moral order. She paused just inside and looked back once at the people gathered outside, at the uniforms, the cameras, the silence, the shame, and the awakening all standing together on the same stone steps. Then she spoke in a voice calm enough to be remembered long after the morning was over. Some people wear authority so they can be feared. Others carry truth so no one else has to bow. And with that, she turned and walked inside, leaving the door open behind her, because the real shock was never that the wrong woman had been stopped. It was that truth had been standing there the whole time, and almost no one recognized it until power gave it a title.